talks from the crypt.
The comedy experience of when The Mask was first out blew my mind.
Right.
I mean, I thought it was funny, but I also think I made it. I don't know if it's my ego. I think Jim Carrey,
it's objectively
Jim
funny.
Carrey literally can't say anything that's not funny when he's in his comedy mode. And I loved it. And then when I put it out there, anything can happen.
Right.
And I had people in different languages loving it, which was great.
Yeah. And now that we're on The Mask, and I've always heard this, that it was supposed to be a horror film. When you watch the movie now, I can't even imagine it as a horror film. Like, how would it even become one? So there was a couple of drafts of the screenplay. When you got it, you said, okay, we're going to turn this into a comedy musical. Not everybody was down at first, but my question is, what did the initial screenplay look like? And how was it horror?
Can I see the credits on Mask? Because let me give the guys credit.
Mike Werb, I know, was the
Mike
co-writer.
Werb came in with me.
Oh, so he wasn't the one who did the original.
Yeah, Mike didn't do the original. That's why I want to look at the credits for a second. And there, let me correct this. This was definitely horror, but there was humor in that horror too, because there was in the comics.
If you click top cast, it'll tell you. I believe there's a crew section.
Mike Fallon and Mike Verheiden. Okay. These guys were great. I believe those were the writers of the original. I did a complete rewrite and did not get credit from the Writers Guild, just going on record. And they said, you wrote 96% of the dialogue, and yet we can't give you credit. The Writers Guild rules have fortunately changed now.
Yeah.
But at the time, they were all against directors. I go, look, I was a writer before I was a director. Why are you punishing me? But it was a group effort, but I did the draft that Jim loved, and we stuck with my draft. But look, so I'll answer your question. It was originally the Dark Horse comic. I'm sure it's still available. It might be a little harder to get now because they redid the comics to match the Jim Carrey mask. But the original comics were black and white. They're what we used to call splatterpunk. They were very disturbing. The mask would have a punchline, a one-liner, and pull an axe out of his pocket and chop up everybody.
Yeah.
And there was a gangster storyline, but the basic idea of him putting on the mask, Stanley Ipkiss was a milquetoast character who changed into kind of a killer when he put the mask on.
And he bought it at a pawn shop, right?
I believe you're right. So I wanted to get deeper into mythology. So for me, it was Loki, the god of humor, the original trickster god.
Yeah, and Leif Erikson.
Yes, and I did shoot a Viking opening, yes, indeed.
Which is crazy that was cut because it was...
Well, it kind of got cut because it was getting expensive to do those opticals.
Yeah.
And we were trying to spend it on the main body of the film.
I heard the boat kept floating back to the shore.
Yes, and we were having a very difficult time getting a 6-man Viking boat in Malibu. Yeah. Sounds like it's going to be super easy, but we had some big surf and people were like falling overboard. It was actually kind of a wreck. So whatever, we did what we could. You can still see part of that scene, I think, in the special things. But I'm getting off the subject. So I basically looked at it and said, if we clean this up and make this really scary, it's equals Freddy Krueger. I had just finished doing Elm Street 3, in my mind anyway. And I thought, you know what? It's a guy, a guy turning into a Freddy Krueger type character who has somewhat magical abilities in the real world, and he's killing people in horrible ways, and imaginative perhaps, but horrible. There was also a scene I recall where they really got into making masks out of people's flesh and rather grotesque things.
Oh wow!
And I there were a lot of drafts. I wasn't in charge of the movie at that time. I just reviewed it and said, look, I'd also had a death in my family. My father had died fairly recently, and I just was over horror for a minute. And I also thought I'm going to be recreating Freddy Krueger, and there's no one as good as Robert Englund, and I don't want him to play the part. Then it's literally Elm Street.
Yeah.
So in my mind, I was a little stuck, and I was such a fan of comedy improv, and Jim Carrey had just come on the scene in Living Color. And I didn't know Jim, but I was so inspired by Jim at the time. And there's a whole thing to my background with my grandpa used to play trumpet in Dixieland in Chicago. My grandma was literally like a dancer, like a post flapper in those years. And I was babysat by them with all that Cab Calloway music. So I thought, why don't we do a magical place? I loved Tim Burton's Batman, I think was done before The Mask. So it was kind of inspired by going full style.
Was that the one with the nipples, Robin?
No. That was
after.
That was Joel Schumacher.
Oh, okay, yeah.
I showed Joel an early cut of The Mask, and he was like very happy with Jim Carrey. And then Joel cast Jim as a Riddler, so I let him come into my editing room to see that stuff. But all those influences came together, and when Jim read the draft that I'd finished, he was like, "It's like it's written for me." And I said, "It certainly is." And if you don't do it, I'm in deep shit, you know?
Who else did you have in mind to do it? Like if Jim Carrey said, no, I'm not going to do this. I don't have time. I'm doing Ace Ventura. Who else could have played him? Because I can't imagine anybody but Jim Carrey.
As you know, he did do Ace Ventura right before we went into production.
Right. And I heard that was a pretty good like marketing material for you guys.
It helped me in post. So I was actually disappointed because I'm into giving people their first chance. And I thought Jim Carrey is going to be the biggest star ever. He'd done Once Bitten, but it wasn't one thing or the other. It was okay, but not really on the radar. It's interesting, you know, but I thought this guy's going to be the biggest star. And then they said, well, we're shooting Ace Ventura first. And I'm like, I met Shadyac later. I'm really glad he did a terrific job, the director. But I just was hoping it would be a hit because it wasn't, you know, Jim was now going to have his feature film identity starting with Ace. But it turned out to be a real plus because I needed more money for my visual effects in post-production when Ace came out, and New Line suddenly realized they could bank on Jim. So it gave us a little rocket engine when we needed it in our post-production budget.
Now, I don't know if this is private information that you gave me at dinner, and I'll beep it if it is, but you said Nick Cage was somebody you would have considered, right?
Yeah, look, I met Nick Cage a couple of times. I never did get to work with him. I'd still like to work with you, Nick, wherever you are.
I'm sure he would love to as well.
My very short list, and you can imagine young Nick Cage in that role because that little maniacal element that is one of Nick's gifts would have played. It would have been interesting. And then Matthew Broderick.
Broderick.
Yeah, and I don't know why, because
Ferris Bueller.
Yeah, maybe Ferris Bueller, because I just was in love with him. And I thought maybe I can put a firecracker up his ass and get the mask out of him. But I didn't really want to go there. Unfortunately, I didn't have to because Jim read it once and he was down with it right away.
And now, was it your idea to incorporate all the Tex Avery style visuals?
Yes, because again, I'd already done a couple of films over a couple of years, and something really bothered me, which was how films age. So when you do wardrobe and music, it's okay, it's cool, it becomes nostalgic to that year. But a couple of things happened. I wanted the mask to be a little more universal and not be connected to that time, and it kind of worked. It still looks cool.
It looks amazing.
I used fashions from the 40s, 60s, and 90s, which we shot it in. We came up with a look that we liked. The zoot suits were part of it, but the other characters you'll also notice are not really in or out of fashion the way we did it. And Edge City itself, it's not Gotham, it's its own. I kind of ran with pollution at the time. You could see the Aurora Borealis in the sky. And
what does he call it? He was
the methane is so beautiful this time of night, you know, at sunset. Whatever it is, I was becoming pollution conscious in that year. But the other thing is I had produced Back to School with Rodney Dangerfield and Robert Downey Jr., one of his early shows. Yeah. And I was so full of myself because I was very young to be a producer at the time. And the show was a hit in America. But when I thought it's going to be great, I went to Cannes and we were trying to sell it, and it did not go well overseas because Rodney Dangerfield in a different language just doesn't work. Right. He's an older guy they don't know, and his eyes are bugging out, and it really didn't work. So I thought, now I get to direct a comedy, a real full-on comedy for the first time, and I wanted to play globally. So I went back to my love of silent film. It's one of the only kinds of film I actually studied in school. I was shocked to find out all the great bits Laurel and Hardy did, and Buster Keaton and the great Charlie Chaplin are some of the same stunt techniques I had learned in the meantime, and they were even more risky because they didn't have the same visual safeties.
Oh yeah, and there's a lot of bleed over when you go back and you look at silent
It's
films,
amazing.
You see that we're still using
Keystone
techniques.
Cops, people hanging off of cars. Though there were some real heroes in those days. Harold Lloyd wore gloves because he blew 3 fingers off his hand.
Oh man!
With a prop, one of those gnarly looking prop bombs that would say "bomb" on it. There was a hot bomb someone made a mistake of giving him.
Now that's practical.
So yeah. So I wanted to use a lot of those techniques, and make a universal story that would go through different languages. And with Jim being such a great physical comedian, I had a unique set of elements in that story and with that cast that it played well all around the globe.
Right. Well, and when I listen to the commentary track, I hear you mention, and I don't know when you recorded the commentary, but it sounded like it was near the release because you were still toying with the idea of a sequel. And I find it interesting because Cameron Diaz has come out and said, oh, I would love to do a sequel of The Mask as long as Jim Carrey is down. And Jim Carrey has openly said he would love to do the story of The Mask. Now, we're talking about the comics. In the comics, Stanley Ipkiss buys The Mask. And again, I don't know the black and white one. The one I have over there is in color. But he buys The Mask at a pawn shop. He brings it home to his wife, who he is in a rut with. Well, Tina and Stanley get together at the end of your movie. Mm-hmm. So there's a storyline right there. They're in a little bit of a rut. Then he goes off and he picks off all of his old enemies. So we know that Cameron is down. We know that Jim is down. What's stopping us?
That's a good question. It's a tricky answer. You know, Jim is
expensive, probably.
No, it's not that. That would work out. Mm-hmm. First of all, let's remember there was a Mask sequel.
Oh,
I was asked to do it. It's nicely forgotten because it missed the. My agent was furious I wouldn't do it. But I wrote a script that Cameron loved, Jim liked, and it was. I don't know how much I should tell about this. It was revolving around Christmas, right? Mm-hmm. Which was perfect because we had so many kids that loved The Mask, and I hadn't realized that would be the case originally. However, Jim was reluctant to do sequels, and years later now he's loosened up about it.
He's done Sonic 2, 3, 5,
correct. But
7.
at that time, New Line wanted to forge ahead. So in one of the scenes in the script I wrote, Stanley Ipkiss, Jim's character, had to take care of a baby, a very naughty baby. And this harks back to a bit W.C. Fields used to do in the black and white films. There were talkies, but it was back in the day where there was a naughty baby. And Jim had to babysit a very evil little baby, and eventually that baby put on the mask. I was trying to duplicate the surprise of Milo putting on the mask in the original.
Right.
So that baby put on a mask. And when Jim wouldn't do that version of the story, New Line loved the baby idea. And so the sequel of The Mask became a Son of the Mask that centered around a baby quite a bit. And it was no longer the spirit of the original. Now,
right.
I can't judge. There's no right or wrong to this, but comedy is hard. I can take an action movie and move it around, a horror film. I can rewrite and put some better scares or work on a character. But comedy has to it's true. Comedy has to be just right in so many ways to have a certain tone, especially something that's original. So I was offered it a couple of times very nicely by New Line, and they were determined to make it. But I said, look, I don't think I'm going to be a big help here.
Yeah.
That was completely different than a version I'd written for Jim and Cameron. And it had its own charm, but I personally couldn't see it, and it wasn't a success.
Well, to your benefit, Son of the Mask was, and I say this respectfully, dog shit.
Watch out. Friends of mine were involved.
Well, and Jamie Kennedy was in it. Jamie Kennedy's a very famous comedic actor, but I think him playing the Mask in this movie kind of showed us that Jim Carrey is Stanley Ipkiss, Mr. Nice Guy.
There are other masks. I'll tell you something I haven't mentioned before. Thinking about who else could play it, from Saturday Night Live, the great
Chris Farley.
Yes,
Chris Farley.
Okay, so what I was saying before, unfortunately, Chris Farley passed away, because if I was going to have to do The Mask without Jim Carrey, I would not call him Stanley Ipkiss, because in the Mask comics, different characters put on the mask, but Chris Farley would have been an ideal alternate mask, a sequel to The Mask with a different character and possibly some of the same villains.
Right.
And it wasn't long after I thought of that terrific idea that unfortunately he passed away so young.
Yeah.
So Chris Farley has definitely had wild mask energy.
Oh, for sure.
So that would have been a great, so there is other Masked movies, and I'll bet you anything there's another Masked movie made if Jim continues to not do it. And I have no thought or opinion. I don't know what's exactly going on in his life at the moment.